Joining me today is New England College professor of political science, Dr. Wayne Lesperance. Wayne, I want to talk about the Democratic convention. And when I think back on conventions, one of the things, the Chicago convention,
Sure.
Huge protests. Are we likely to see any of that in this convention?
I think we're certainly going to see protests in ways we haven't seen in a while. I mean, maybe as far back as Chicago. Look, there's a lot of, that's not unrest, but there's a lot of discord in this country, whether it's around the officer shootings that we've been seeing in the last recent days, or it's just general frustration with the choices people have for their presidential candidates. We're going to see, and it's not going to be just Republicans protesting Democrats. We're going to see Black Lives Matter, I'm sure, at both conventions, trying to make sure that they raise their profile and raise their issues. I expect this is going to be a security nightmare for the Secret Service, just managing all the moving parts, not the traditional ones of students that are upset about something or the media, but probably very well organized and potentially very scary groups that are really trying to be disruptive. And so that to me is the wild card in these conventions.
Are we? And I know this whole show this segment's more on the Democratic side, but just while I have you there, is it likely that we're going to see greater protests in one versus the other convention?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to guess, I would say yes for the Trump convention, Republican convention, because Trump is such a polarizing figure and Trump is such a high-profile figure. So I imagine if you had to say which would be more protested, I think the Republicans in Cleveland are bracing for a real, well, it's the heart of rock and roll, right, in Cleveland. So it's going to be a raucous time.
Okay. How will that have any lasting negative impacts for the parties?
Depending on how they're handled. I mean, if we see, riot police clearing the streets and tear gas, and I mean, the same images that you remember from Chicago, if we see that as defining the convention experience, then sure, I think that people will say, gosh, maybe I'm not so comfortable with this candidate.
Are there groups that actually want that to happen?
Sure. I mean, protests, there are any number of different groups out there, and most of them want to peacefully communicate their message. But as we have seen around, for example, the World Trade Organization, when they've had meetings here in the United States, there are groups out there that really, and we saw them in Ferguson, really want to raise the stakes. They want to raise the heat. And I think that seeing violence take place for them helps to raise their profile and expose for them what is a corrupt political system. So, yeah, I think there are folks who are very invested in seeing violence happen.
Is that good for American democracy?
Protest is good for American democracy. We ought to speak truth to power. We ought to raise our voices when we're concerned about things. Violence is not good for American democracy, and I don't think that most voters are moved in a positive direction when they see people engage in lawlessness and recklessness. That puts people's lives in danger. So it's a fine line. I don't know that the folks that are interested in violence are particularly interested in democracy. I think they just want to get their point across. Will
that ultimately, though, if there is, and hopefully there isn't, and we're taping before it begins, so we just don't know, will that play into sort of Trump's messaging on I'm strong, we're going to handle this inadvertently?
Depends on how it all plays out. If you remember back to some of the protests that he encountered in places like California and the Southwest, when there are protesters carrying Mexican flags and causing trouble, that makes it very easy for him to say, look, this is the problem. This is why we need that big wall that Mexico is going to pay for. So I guess it depends on how the framing wars go and who gets blamed for causing all the unrest. There is an opportunity, though, there for Trump to really say this is part of what the problem is, and I'm going to drive this.
Is it possible for Clinton and her candidacy to sort of capture some of that movement and channel it into the Democratic Party?
That requires a real deft touch. But certainly in the past, we've seen Bernie Sanders embrace the Black Lives Matter movement and say, I'm with you, and brought them right up on the stage with him. So there are ways you can do it. I think the Secret Service would have some pretty strong views about that. But there are ways that it can be done. It takes a light touch.
But did that actually, and Bernie doing that, did that help him?
I think so. We looked at how well he did with African American voters, for example, in places like South Carolina.
Yep.
I think people pointed to that as saying, hey, he gets it.
So at the end of the day, this same protest, the Black Lives Matters, who likely will be able to pull that into their party Republicans or Democrats?
For the Black Lives Matter movement, it's the Democrats. I don't see the Republicans playing. But I think you'll see groups like the NRA, organized groups, or gun rights groups, for example, getting involved. The Republicans will try to wrap their arms around. So there's folks on both sides.
All right, so, and I'm asking you to make predictions, but we're out of time. When we return, I'm going to ask them to make more predictions, so please stay with us.